What are your thoughts on the fate of serial killers upon their apprehension? While certain individuals may face grim outcomes, others experience their time in incarceration in unforeseen manners. This video discusses Richard Ramirez, who encountered a startling conclusion after spending years on death row. Additionally, we explore Aileen Wuornos, known as the Damsel of Death, whose unexpected marriage to a wealthy woman while in prison astonished many prior to her contentious execution. Let's delve into the details of these notorious cases, starting with Ted Bundy. American serial killer and rapist Ted Bundy remains one of the most notorious criminals of the late 20th century. During his lifetime, in the 1970s, he admitted to 30 murders, mostly women. He was apprehended in February 1978 and subsequently received 3 distinct death sentences from 1979 to 1980. These sentences were imposed for the murders of 2 members of the Chi Omega sorority at Florida State University, as well as a 12-year-old girl. Instead of being shunned, Bundy gained notoriety during his trial, largely due to his charismatic appearance. He would spend the following 9 years on death row, contesting his sentence. After the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his appeal, he ultimately faced execution by electrocution in 1989. On the fateful day around 7 a.m., Bundy was executed at a Florida state prison in an electric chair, often regarded as Old Sparky. The execution was to the cheering of crowds who set off fireworks to celebrate Bundy's execution. Certain individuals went to the extent of striking frying pans while chanting, "Burn, Bundy, burn." After his execution, scientists were required to extract his brain for examination. Their objective was to determine whether any physical abnormalities could account for his violent conduct during his lifetime. Regrettably, no such abnormalities were found. While Bundy exhibited manipulative charm, the subsequent killer revealed a disturbing level of depravity. Jeffrey Dahmer. As one of the most infamous American cannibals and serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer was responsible for the deaths of 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. Most of his victims were poor and African American, Asian, or Latino. In numerous instances of murder that he later committed, he engaged in the permanent preservation of body parts, encompassing either the entire skeleton or portions thereof. Nevertheless, his series of killings came to a sudden halt in July 1991. Following his arrest, he admitted guilt to all charges brought against him, resulting in 15 consecutive life sentences in Wisconsin, along with an additional sentence in Ohio. Shortly after his confessions in 1991, Dahmer began to embrace Christianity, ultimately identifying as a born-again Christian. However, while incarcerated in 1994, he was assaulted by another inmate, Christopher Scarver, in the prison gym. Scarver struck Dahmer on the head with a metal bar. Although Dahmer was still alive when found, he was declared dead 1 hour after being transported to a nearby hospital. Regrettably, Dahmer was not the sole victim. Jesse Anderson, another convicted murderer, was also killed during this incident, as he was present in the gym at that moment. Dahmer's gruesome acts concluded violently, in stark contrast to the subsequent killer, whose own strangling hands ultimately faced a similar fate. Roger Kibbe. Popularly known as the I-5 Strangler, in the 1970s and 1980s, Roger Kibbe was a California serial killer. He was first arrested for assault and battery in 1987, leading to his conviction and sentencing to 8 months in jail. The following year, Kibbe was arrested for the murder of Darcy Frackenpole the previous year. He was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years of incarceration. On 2 separate occasions, first in 2003 and again in 2007, Kibbe led prosecutors and detectives to a dry creek where he alleged he had murdered one of his victims in 1977. However, the body was never recovered. Consequently, a grand jury was assembled and a plea deal was offered to circumvent the death penalty. Nevertheless, on November 5, 2009, Kibbe admitted guilt to the murders of 6 additional women, resulting in 6 more life sentences. Kibbe frequently abducted his victims, restraining them and silencing them with duct tape. He would then cut their clothing with scissors. In some instances, he sexually assaulted his victims before strangling them to death. Tragically, in 2021, while incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in California, Kibbe was killed by his cellmate, Jason Boudreaux, a self-proclaimed Satanist who later asserted that he committed the murder to avenge the victims. While Kibbe was known for strangling his victims, the subsequent serial killer adopted a nomadic lifestyle before evolving into a murderer. Kibbe utilized strangulation, whereas the next killer preferred a firearm as her weapon of choice. Aileen Wuornos. Serial killer Aileen Wuornos, who had exhibited unusual sexual behavior as a child, was convicted for murdering 6 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990. At the time when she started her killing spree, she was nicknamed Damsel of Death, as she fatally shot her victims. In January 1991, her streak of fortune came to an abrupt end when she was apprehended. During recorded interviews, she admitted to committing 7 murders. Her first trial commenced in 1992 for the murder of Mallory. She was subsequently convicted of first-degree murder and robbery, resulting in a death sentence. evidence. 2 months later, Wuornos opted to plead no contest to the murders of Spears, Burris, and Humphreys. She later entered separate guilty pleas for the murders of Carskadden and Antonio. To her astonishment, she received a death sentence for each of these pleas, culminating in death sentences across all 6 cases against her. After spending a decade on death row, Florida Governor Jeb Bush lifted a temporary stay of execution in 2002, having determined that Wuornos was mentally competent to comprehend the implications of the death penalty. On October 9th of that year, she was executed by lethal injection at the age of 46. While Wuornos committed her crimes out of desperation, the subsequent killer, a cult leader, orchestrated murders in pursuit of a misguided ideology. Charles Manson. An American criminal, cult leader, and musician, Charles Manson led the Manson family, a California-based cult, in the late 1960s. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder for the deaths of at least 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate, who was heavily pregnant. Charles Manson spent a significant portion of his life in correctional facilities prior to committing the murders for which he is infamous. In 1972, his original sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. He is believed to have been responsible for approximately 35 murders, the majority of which he directed rather than executed himself. Upon the arrest of Manson and his followers, there was no direct evidence linking him to the homicides. They were apprehended on suspicion of vandalizing a section of Death Valley National Park, where they had been residing. Manson proclaimed himself to be the Messiah and warned his followers of an impending nuclear attack, claiming that only those who were with him in a concealed desert enclave would survive. In 2014, Manson became engaged to 26-year-old Afton Elaine Burton, although their marriage lasted only a year. Tragically, Manson passed away from natural causes 2 years after his marriage license with Burton expired. He had spent over 46 years in prison due to his numerous offenses. While Manson orchestrated the killings, another individual, notorious for wearing a clown costume, personally took the lives of his victims. John Wayne Gacy. Often called the killer clown, John Wayne Gacy was one of the worst serial killers in the history of the United States. He reportedly murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men in Cook County, Illinois. He buried most of his victims in his Norwood Park home. His nickname, Killer Clown, was derived from his penchant for dressing in a clown costume and applying makeup. He would entice his victims to his residence under the pretense of offering construction work or other deceptive means, subsequently subjecting them to sexual assault and torture before ultimately strangling them to death. Gacy was apprehended in 1979. Although he confessed to the murders, he claimed that he was not mentally competent. However, the prosecution argued that he was sane and fully aware of his actions, particularly given the meticulous planning and concealment of his crimes. In 1980, Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders and was sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, during which time he continuously appealed his sentence. While incarcerated, he took up painting, and many of his artworks featuring himself as Pogo the Clown were showcased in an exhibition at a gallery in Chicago. Ultimately, Gacy was executed by lethal injection in 1994. His heinous acts, however, pale in comparison to those committed by a Soviet serial killer who embarked on a spree of strangulation. Nikolai Fefilov. Known as the Ural Strangler, Nikolai Fefilov was a Soviet serial killer who killed at least 7 women and girls in Sverdlovsk between 1982 and 1988. 6 of the murders involved rape. He would rape his victims before strangling them. Fefilov had previously served in the Soviet army before his demobilization. It is believed that his motivation for the murders of women stemmed from a rejection by a woman he had loved. He was apprehended in 1988 while attempting to dispose of his most recent victim. Following his arrest, Fefilov began to disclose details of his past offenses, including the murder of Mangusheva, for which Georgy Khabarov had been wrongfully convicted and executed. His confessions required verification to avoid potential scandal, and to the astonishment of the authorities, his statements were corroborated. Forensic psychiatric evaluations conducted on Fefilov concluded that he was sane. Tragically, while awaiting trial and the possibility of conviction, Fefilov was strangled by his cellmate in prison. Although the police leadership and the prosecutor's office in Sverdlovsk were implicated in Fefilov's death, suggesting they wished to prevent him from surviving long enough to stand trial, no evidence supported this claim. 2 months later, the criminal case against Nikolai Fefilov was closed due to his death. While Fefilov met a grim fate at the hands of his cellmate, the depraved mind of the Gray Man continued to seek out children for his horrific cannibalistic act. Andrei Chikatilo. Known as the Butcher of Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo was a Soviet serial killer who murdered at least 50 people over the period of 18 years, between 1978 and 1990. Chikatilo's trial faced significant challenges, not only due to the large number of victims involved, but also because the prevailing ideology of the country did not acknowledge the phenomenon of serial murder within a communist framework. It was reported that during his childhood, Chikatilo's mother frequently recounted the tale of his older brother, who was allegedly kidnapped and consumed by neighbors. Although this story remains unverified, it may have influenced Chikatilo's later acts of cannibalism against some of his victims. In 1984, Chikatilo was apprehended by a police officer who witnessed him assaulting a girl at a train station. He was charged with theft and received a 1-year prison sentence, but was released after serving only 3 months. He then resumed his series of murders at bus and train stations. Ultimately, in 1990, he was arrested after being identified as the primary suspect in the ongoing investigations. While in custody, Chikatilo admitted to his crimes and was taken to various crime scenes to illustrate his methods to law enforcement. He was ultimately convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. In 1994, he was executed by gunshot in a prison in Moscow. Chikatilo operated within a system that refused to acknowledge his existence, presenting a stark contrast to a murderer whose confessions often blurred the boundaries between reality and fiction. Albert Fish. Known by different nicknames, including the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Moon Maniac, Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was an American serial killer, rapist, child molester, and cannibal. He committed at least 3 child murders between 1924 and 1928. In addition to the 3 murders to which Fish admitted, he was implicated in at least 10 other homicides. He also confessed to having stabbed at least 2 additional individuals. Furthermore, he claimed to have killed approximately 100 people, a statement that remains unsubstantiated. In 1934, Fish was arrested and subsequently tried for the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd, whom he had lured by asking her parents to allow her to accompany him to a party for his niece. The trial, which spanned 10 days, saw Fish plead insanity, asserting that he had received divine instructions to kill children. Several psychiatrists later diagnosed him with various sexual disorders, including sadism, masochism, flagellation, and exhibitionism. Eventually, Fish was found to be sane and guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death by electrocution. It was reported that Fish assisted the executioner in positioning the electrodes on his body before he said his last words. "I don't even know why I'm here." He was 65 years of age at the time of his electrocution. His remains were interred in the cemetery of Sing Sing prison. In addition to Fish, who committed atrocious acts against children, there exists another murderer who exploited society's most defenseless individuals for almost 20 years. Henry Lee Lucas. He was a murderer best known for allegedly killing hundreds of people in the 1960s and 1970s, though only 3, including his mother, were confirmed. At a young age, Lucas became a sex deviant, having sex with his half-brother and dead animals. Lucas experienced multiple incarcerations during his adolescence. In March 1960, he received a sentence of 20 to 40 years for the murder of his mother. Following this conviction, he was transferred to Jackson State Penitentiary in southern Michigan, where he made 2 suicide attempts. Subsequently, he was admitted to Ionia State Mental Hospital. After serving a decade, he was paroled in 1970. However, he continued to engage in criminal activities, and just 1 year post-release, he was sentenced to an additional 5 years for attempting to kidnap a 15-year-old girl at gunpoint. In 1983, Lucas was arrested once more for possession of a deadly weapon. During his time in prison, he confessed to committing hundreds of murders, although only 3 of these confessions could be substantiated. He was ultimately sentenced to death, but Texas Governor George W. Bush later commuted this sentence to life imprisonment. While on death row, Lucas reportedly embraced Christianity and spent the final 18 years of his life as a model inmate. Tragically, he passed away in prison from heart failure in 2001 at the age of 64. Although Lucas's assertions of having killed 100 individuals could not be verified, the claims of a British serial killer were confirmed and even inspired a television series. Peter Sutcliffe. Known as Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe was a British serial killer who carried out a murder spree between 1975 and 1980, resulting in at least 13 deaths. His crimes have been the subject of the ITV 7-part miniseries The Long Shadow. Although the majority of his victims were sex workers, law enforcement failed to capitalize on numerous opportunities to apprehend him. There was an instance when police disregarded a victim simply because she did not conform to their established prostitute killer profile. In 1981, Sutcliffe was apprehended for utilizing counterfeit counterfeit license plates. Upon his arrest, authorities uncovered additional evidence that prompted a more extensive investigation. During questioning, he admitted to murdering several women whose deaths were under investigation by the police. Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 murders and 7 attempted murders, ultimately receiving a sentence of 20 life terms, with a recommendation for a minimum of 30 years. The death penalty had been abolished in 1965. However, in 1984, Sutcliffe was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which resulted in his transfer to a secure psychiatric institution. His requests for parole were consistently denied. After spending some time in the hospital, he was deemed stable and transferred to a maximum security prison in 2016, where he endured multiple assaults. On one occasion, an inmate attacked him, stabbing his eyes with a pen, which led to the loss of vision in one eye. He ultimately passed away in prison due to complications from COVID-19 in 2020. While Sutcliffe's reign of terror was confined to the streets of Yorkshire, the next killer's impact extended across continents. Jack Unterweger. He was an Austrian serial killer who murdered several women. After he was abused and abandoned as a child, he went on to live with an alcoholic grandfather for 7 years. Unterweger became involved in criminal activities and was first apprehended at the age of 16 for assaulting a sex worker. He also committed the murder of an 18-year-old prostitute. In 1976, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. During his incarceration, he acquired literacy skills. In 1984, his autobiographical work, which can be translated as Purgatory or The Trip to Jail, Report of a Guilty Man, achieved bestseller status. Convinced of his rehabilitation, the state granted him parole in 1990. Following his release, he gained notoriety as a literary figure, making appearances on talk shows and securing various speaking engagements. However, after a series of murders involving sex workers, law enforcement placed Unterweger under surveillance. It took several months for them to collect sufficient evidence to effectuate his arrest. In 1992, he was taken into custody and subsequently convicted of 9 counts of murder. Shortly after his sentencing in 1994, Unterweger took his own life by hanging himself with the string from his prison uniform. While Unterweger concealed his criminal activities behind a facade of literary success, another murderer operated under the guise of a medical professional to commit his heinous acts. Harold Shipman. Nicknamed Dr. Death, Harold Shipman was a British doctor and serial killer who reportedly murdered about 250 of his patients. In 1998, an 81-year-old woman, who happened to be one of his patients, was discovered dead in her home a few hours after he visited her. The family was taken aback, as the deceased seemed to be in good health prior to her passing. More concerning was the discovery that her will, particularly regarding her £400,000 estate, had been altered to favor Shipman. Instead of requesting an autopsy to establish his innocence, Shipman deemed it unnecessary. In 2000, he was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, leading to a life sentence. Tragically, while incarcerated, he took his own life by hanging in his cell. Years later, an official report estimated that his victims numbered around 250 since 1971. It was reported that he administered lethal doses of diamorphine to his victims, subsequently attributing their deaths to natural causes. Speculation arose that Shipman may have committed these murders as a form of revenge for his mother's death, while others posited that he believed he was performing euthanasia. Another theory suggested that he enjoyed wielding the power of life and death over his patients. Shipman exploited the trust placed in him as a physician, contrasting sharply with another individual who engaged in cannibalism. Joachim Kroll. Known as Ruhr Cannibal, Joachim Kroll was a German serial killer who terrorized West Germany for more than 20 years, eating the flesh of his victims because he considered meat to be expensive. Kroll managed to dodge the law for 20 years, so long that 6 other guys ended up getting arrested for his crimes. His violent rampage was supposedly sparked by the butchering of a pig, which he claimed often turned him on. His one shot at a romantic relationship with a woman went south pretty quickly. As he turned into a killer, Kroll would strangle his victims and assault them. He even reportedly got off while looking at their bodies. Eventually, he took things a step further and started practicing cannibalism. He would cut pieces of flesh from his victims, particularly those who were young and tender, then take the meat home to cook. Kroll's gruesome spree came to an end in 1976 when he was caught after a neighbor saw him dismembering a body part and called the cops. Once in custody, he confessed to multiple murders and admitted to cannibalism. After spending several years behind bars, he was convicted of 8 murders and 1 attempted murder, receiving a life sentence in 1982. Sadly, he passed away in prison 9 years later from a heart attack. Even with Kroll's horrific acts of cannibalism, they pale in comparison to the vile deeds of the serial killer known as the Beast of Chicago. H. Holmes. An American swindler widely considered the country's first known serial killer, H.H. Holmes, lured victims into his home. Sometimes referred to as the Beast of Chicago, Holmes is said to have killed between 20 and 200 people. He was said to have murdered many of his victims in a specially designed house, which earned the nickname Murder Castle. The upper levels of the building contained his living space and a few small rooms where he tortured and killed his victims before incinerating their bodies in the basement and getting rid of the remains in a kiln. During the 1893 Columbian Exposition, Holmes turned his home into a hotel for visitors, where he ended up killing several guests. He often lured women there with job offers, only to con and murder them. While serving time for fraud, Holmes shared his secrets with a fellow inmate, the infamous outlaw Marion Hedgepeth, who later disclosed that Holmes's real name was H.M. Howard. Holmes was finally caught in November 1894. Although he spun various tales to the police while in custody, he ultimately confessed to killing 27 people. He was convicted in 1895, and despite appealing his sentence, he was unsuccessful. He met his end on May 7, 1896, after being hanged for the murder of Pitezel. These prison tales show what happened to people who once instilled fear across the globe. Their ultimate downfall was definitely a fitting consequence for the choices they made.